My stepfather stood in front of 40 investors and called another man's son the future of this family, and I was closer to that microphone than anyone else in the room. I want you to know, before I tell you what was folded up in my apron pocket while he said it, that I hadn't come to that gala expecting to say a single word. I'd come to cook. The kitchen doors were propped open behind the podium, and the whole room smelled like the garlic and olive oil I'd had simmering since 4 that afternoon, a smell I associate so completely with my mother that even now, for years after she died, it still makes my chest tighten before my brain catches up to why. My hand found the worn leather notebook in my apron pocket without my even deciding to reach for it, the same notebook my mother filled with recipes in her own handwriting for 20 years, the notebook I have never once cooked a service without having somewhere on my body. Tyler represents the future of this family, Marcus said, one hand on my stepbrother's shoulder, his voice carrying easily across a room gone quiet to listen. The real family running this place going forward. Nobody in that room turned to look at me, standing 30 feet away in my chef's whites, the person who had cooked every single dish being served that night. Not one head turned. I'm Joe Calloway. I'm 32, and I've been the executive chef at Calloway's, my mother's restaurant, for 6 years, long enough to earn it a spot on the regional Michelin Guide's recommended list, long enough to have burned my forearms into permanent small white scars I don't mind at all. If you've ever stood in a room while someone rewrote who you were to a group of strangers, in real time, without ever once looking your way, I think you already know exactly how the next few minutes went. Stay with me, because that notebook in my apron was about to make Marcus's sentence the last confident thing he said all night. My mother, Renata, co-founded this restaurant with Marcus 13 years ago. She'd been gone 4 years by the night of that gala, ovarian cancer, diagnosed too late to do much more than get her affairs in order with the specific, unhurried calm of a woman who had spent her whole life running a professional kitchen and knew exactly how to close one down properly. I was the only person in that room who had actually watched her write her name for the last time, on a document none of them yet knew existed, 3 months before she died, in Priya's small downtown office, her handwriting already a little shakier than it used to be but still, unmistakably, hers. Before I tell you what happened after Marcus said that sentence, I want to say something about why I'm telling you this at all. This isn't really a story about a restaurant, even though a restaurant is where it happened. It's a story about being told, in front of a room full of people who mattered to a business's future, that you weren't really the family running it, while the paper that said otherwise sat folded in your own pocket the entire time. This channel exists for stories exactly like this one, where the person making the confident announcement isn't the one who ends up being right, and where the real answer isn't a scene, but a single sentence spoken calmly into a quiet room. If that's the kind of story that keeps you watching, hit subscribe now, because I've got a lot more of them, and I think you're going to want to be here for what Marcus didn't know I already owned. I should say plainly, my mother didn't leave me half this restaurant out of spite toward Marcus. She left it to me because I was the one still standing in that kitchen every single night, long after the marriage that started it had quietly become something else. Everyone at that gala had their own relationship to Marcus, their own version of what he'd built. This is simply the part of the story I happened to be standing closest to, the whole time. I grew up in restaurant kitchens the way some kids grow up on baseball diamonds, underfoot at first, then useful, then, eventually, essential. My mother, Renata, ran the pasta station at a small Italian place in downtown Asheville before she ever had a restaurant of her own, and I remember being maybe 6 years old, sitting on an overturned bus tub in the corner of that kitchen, watching her hands move over dough with a kind of certainty I associated, as a child, with magic rather than skill. By the time I was 12, she'd let me start rolling gnocchi myself, correcting my technique with the same patient, exacting attention she gave everything in that kitchen. I was terrible at it for almost a year. She never once let me believe that mattered less than getting better. My father had never really been in the picture. He and my mother separated when I was 2, and he moved to Oregon not long after, sending a card on my birthday most years and little else. I don't say that with much bitterness anymore. It simply meant that for most of my childhood, it was the 2 of us, and then, eventually, whichever kitchen my mother happened to be working in, which functioned as a kind of extended family long before Marcus ever entered the picture. I knew the names of every line cook and dishwasher at that first restaurant before I knew most of my own classmates. I think that's part of why the idea of family always felt, to me, less like a fixed unit of people and more like whoever showed up, night after night, and did the actual work. My mother used to say that a kitchen tells you the truth about someone faster than almost any other environment will, because there's nowhere to hide during a Friday dinner rush. Either you can keep pace or you can't, either you help the person next to you when they're buried or you don't, and no amount of charm survives 4 consecutive tickets going out wrong. I think she measured people, quietly, by that standard for her entire life, in and out of the kitchen, and I think, looking back, that standard is exactly what she was applying when she decided who should actually inherit what she'd built. Marcus came into our lives when I was 17, a quiet, capable man who managed the front of house at the restaurant where my mother cooked, and married her 2 years later, when I was 19 and already working there myself on weekends. I want to be fair to him, because for a long time, a genuinely long time, most of a decade, he was a good stepfather to me, in the unglamorous, unremarkable way that actually matters. He came to my culinary school graduation and sat through all 4 hours of a ceremony he had no real obligation to attend, and cried, a little, when they read my name. He co-signed the loan on my first apartment when the bank wouldn't take my income alone. He never once, in all those years, made me feel like an obligation rather than a daughter, and I want that on the record clearly, because it makes what happened later harder to explain, not easier. When my mother and Marcus opened Callaway's together, 13 years ago now, pooling every cent of savings either of them had, I was the first person they hired, 22 years old and desperate to prove I belonged in a kitchen that had my mother's name over the door. I remember the exact week we opened, 3 days of chaos, a walk-in cooler that failed on our second night, my mother running triage on both the kitchen and Marcus's visible panic at the same time, entirely unbothered, entirely in her element. I remember thinking, watching her that week, that I had never once seen anyone look so completely certain of what they were building. For a long time, it worked exactly the way you'd hope it would. My mother ran the kitchen, Marcus ran the front of house and the books. I worked my way up from prep cook to sous chef to, eventually, executive chef, the year I turned 26, when my mother finally stepped back from the line to focus on the parts of the business that had started to interest her more, sourcing, menu development, the notebook. I remember the night she told me she was promoting me, both of us alone in the kitchen after close, the dish pit finally quiet, the last of the staff gone home. She'd poured us each a small glass of the Chianti we kept for staff meals and told me, without much ceremony, that she'd been watching me run the pass for the better part of a year and that it was time I stopped asking her permission for decisions I was already making correctly on my own. "You don't need my name over the door to know what you're doing in this kitchen," she said. "You never did. I just liked being the one who got to watch you figure that out." I still think about that sentence more than almost anything else she ever said to me. Marcus, for his part, threw himself into the business side of things in those years with real energy, negotiating better terms with our produce suppliers, building relationships with local food writers, expanding the wine list into something genuinely respected around town. I want to be fair to him again here, because it would be easy, in hindsight, to rewrite those years as though the cracks were always visible, and they weren't. For most of a decade, Marcus was exactly the partner my mother needed, in exactly the ways that mattered. That notebook. I should tell you about it properly, because it matters for everything that comes after. My mother kept a recipe notebook from the time she was in her 20s, well before I was born, a battered leather-bound thing, her handwriting evolving across its pages from a careful young cook's block print to the loose, confident scrawl of someone who'd stopped needing to measure most things by the time she wrote them down. Every dish that ever appeared on Callaway's menu started as a line in that notebook. I still cook from it today, not because I need the instructions anymore, I could make her Sunday gravy blind, at this point, but because some part of me needs to see her handwriting before service starts, the way some people need a certain song or a certain prayer. My mother was diagnosed with ovarian cancer 4.5 years ago, stage 4 by the time anyone caught it, the particular cruelty of a cancer that hides well until it doesn't. She lived for about 6 months after the diagnosis, most of it spent exactly the way she wanted to spend it, in the restaurant, on good days, sitting at the corner table by the kitchen pass with a cup of tea, watching the dinner rush with an expression I can only describe as deeply, quietly satisfied. I remember one evening, maybe 2 months before she died, when she was too weak to sit up for a full service but insisted on being wheeled in anyway, wrapped in a blanket at that same corner table, just to watch. I brought her a small plate from the pass, nothing she needed to eat, just something to have in front of her, the way you set a place for someone even when you know they won't finish the meal. She held my hand for a long moment before I went back to the line and said, "This is the only classroom I ever really needed you to graduate from. You already have." I didn't understand, at the time, how literally she meant that. I assumed she was talking about cooking. I understand now she was talking about something much larger. She married Marcus for love, and I believe that completely, even now. But I want to be honest about something else too, because it matters. In the last year of her life, I watched my mother start to see him more clearly than either of us had let ourselves see him before. Not as a bad man. Just as a man whose loyalty, it turned out, was a little more conditional on comfort than either of us had wanted to believe. There was a specific afternoon, a few months before her diagnosis, when a health inspector flagged a minor violation in the walk-in cooler, nothing serious, an easy fix, but the kind of thing that rattles a small business owner more than it probably should. Marcus spent that entire afternoon anxious and short-tempered, snapping at a server over something unrelated, and my mother watched him from across the dining room with an expression I didn't understand at the time. She told me, driving home that night, he handles fear by getting smaller and looking for someone steady to stand near. I used to think that was sweet. I'm starting to wonder what happens if I'm not the steady one anymore. I didn't understand what she meant until years later, watching him lean, instinctively, toward Deborah's certainty instead of sitting with his own uncertainty directly. Marcus remarried 2 years after my mother died, a woman named Deborah, whom he'd met through a mutual friend, kind enough on the surface, careful and precise in exactly the way that makes it hard to point to any single moment and call it unkind. She was warm to me at first, in the careful, slightly overcorrected way people are warm to someone they've hurt is grieving, and I appreciated it, genuinely, in those early months. It was only gradually, over the following year, that I started noticing the specific vocabulary she used: our restaurant, our future, our family, always inclusive of herself and her son, never quite including me in the same breath, even though I was the one standing in the kitchen every single night that Marcus and Deborah went home together. Deborah had a son from her first marriage, Tyler, 30 years old, who had bounced between a handful of vague marketing jobs before Marcus, eager to please his new wife, started finding him a role at Callaway's, first as a brand consultant, then, gradually, as something closer to a co-owner in everything but paperwork, despite never once, in 3 years, working a full dinner service in that kitchen. I remember the first time Tyler suggested, in a menu planning meeting, that we streamline my mother's Sunday gravy recipe to cut prep time, entirely unaware that the dish had been on the menu, unchanged, since the week the restaurant opened, and that changing it would have meant erasing one of the last things of my mother's still actively alive in that building. I said no, calmly, and Marcus backed me, that time. It wouldn't always go that way in the years that followed. Tyler wasn't cruel, exactly, and I want to be fair to him too, because it would be easy to make him into a simpler villain than he actually was. He was mostly just adrift, a 30-year-old man who had never found anything he was good enough at to feel secure in, handed, through no real effort of his own, a title at a respected restaurant that gave him a kind of confidence he clearly hadn't earned yet. I don't think he set out to take credit for things that weren't his. I think he genuinely didn't understand the difference between being present for something and being responsible for it, and nobody in his life had ever required him to learn that difference the hard way, the way every single cook in my kitchen had to learn it, one botched service at a time. Deborah, for her part, doted on him with the specific, absolute confidence of a parent who has never had to consider that their child might not be the center of every room he enters. She wasn't unkind to me directly, not in any single sentence I could point to and call cruel. It was, again, a texture rather than an event, the 2 years of our restaurant, the way she'd introduced Tyler to guests as though his title were self-evidently earned, the way she never once, in 2 years, asked me a single question about my own history in that kitchen, as though the 6 years I'd spent as executive chef were simply background scenery to the story she'd already decided to tell about her son's rising importance. My mother told me about her diagnosis on a Tuesday afternoon in the restaurant's back office, both of us still in our kitchen whites, the lunch rush just finishing outside the door. She was remarkably calm about it, in the way she was calm about everything in a professional kitchen, assessing the situation, gathering the information she needed, making a plan. Within a week, she had called Priya Anand, the accountant who'd handled the restaurant's books since it opened, and asked her to draw up paperwork neither of us had discussed with anyone else. "I need to protect the restaurant," my mother told me, sitting across from Priya's desk a few days later, "and I need to protect you, and those aren't automatically the same thing if I'm not careful about how I do this." The document Priya drew up was a stock transfer agreement, straightforward and fully legal. My mother's 50% ownership stake in Callaway's, transferred directly into my name, effective immediately, recorded with the state and with the restaurant's own corporate paperwork. Not a will, not an inheritance to be settled later. A direct transfer, completed 3 months before she died, while she was still entirely of sound mind and entirely capable of explaining exactly why she was doing it. "I don't want you to say anything to Marcus about this," she said to me afterward, in the truck on the drive home, her hand steady on the wheel despite everything. "Not because I don't trust him. Because I know exactly what would happen if he knew. He'd start being careful with you in a way that has nothing to do with actually caring about you, and I have spent my whole life able to tell the difference between those two things, and I need you to be able to tell the difference too, even after I'm not here to point it out anymore. Let him treat you well because you're my daughter and you've earned your place in that kitchen. Not because a piece of paper says he has to." I asked her, that same drive, why 50%, and not some smaller symbolic share? She was quiet for a moment before she answered. "Because I built that place with my hands as much as he built it with his money, and because I know who's actually going to be standing in that kitchen in 20 years, and it isn't going to be him behind the stove. It's you. The ownership should reflect the truth of the place, even if nobody else knows the truth yet." I remember sitting in Priya's office the day we signed everything, my mother in a blazer she'd clearly chosen specifically for the occasion, steady-handed and precise as she reviewed every clause before signing, the same exacting attention she gave a recipe or a hollandaise that was threatening to break. Priya had known my mother for over a decade by then, had done the restaurant's taxes since its first year, and I remember her pausing, pen in hand, before she signed as witness, looking at my mother with an expression I didn't fully understand until much later, a kind of quiet, professional grief, the look of someone watching a friend put her affairs in careful order because she had already accepted what was coming. "You'll take care of this place," my mother said to me afterward, not a question. "Not because you have to. Because you already do, every night, whether anyone's counting or not. I want to be honest with you about carrying that secret for 4 years, because it wasn't the quiet, satisfying kind of leverage you might imagine. It was a weight I carried into every single staff meeting, every menu planning session where Marcus increasingly deferred to Tyler's opinion on things Tyler had no real expertise in, every time Deborah referred to our restaurant in a tone that included herself and her son and quietly excluded me, the person actually cooking in it 7 nights a week. I sat with all of it and said nothing, because my mother had asked me to wait, and waiting for the right moment was the last thing I could still do exactly the way she'd asked. I want to tell you about one specific dinner service, about 2 years after the transfer, because it's the moment I understood exactly how far things had already drifted. We were in the middle of a Friday rush, fully booked, when Tyler wandered into the kitchen, a place he rarely entered during service, to tell me, in front of my entire line, that he'd promised a food blogger a surprise off-menu tasting in 20 minutes, something he'd arranged without checking with me at all. I remember the specific, controlled fury of having to absorb that in real time, in front of my own cooks, and handling it anyway, because the restaurant's reputation mattered more in that moment than my own frustration. I built a 5-course tasting out of ingredients we already had on hand, in under 20 minutes, and it went beautifully, and Tyler took a photo with the blogger afterward that appeared on the restaurant's Instagram captioned, "Always innovating, thanks for trusting me with tonight's surprise." My name did not appear anywhere in the post. If you've ever had to carry something like that quietly, doing the real work while somebody else got the title for it, drop the words "the recipe" in the comments below. I have a feeling a lot of you already know exactly what that particular kind of waiting costs, and I'd like to hear about it. There was a particular evening, about a year after the transfer, when Marcus and I closed up the restaurant together, just the two of us, the way we used to before Deborah and Tyler became fixtures in the business. He asked me, out of nowhere, whether I ever resented how much responsibility had fallen on me since my mother died. I told him honestly that I didn't resent the work, I loved the work, but that I sometimes felt like a very well-compensated employee in a place my own mother had built, rather than someone with any real say in its direction. He nodded slowly, the way people do when they're absorbing something they don't quite want to sit with. "You have more say than you think you do," he said, which struck me, at the time, as a strange thing to say, and which I understood completely only years later, standing in front of that Gala crowd. I want to tell you about the year Tyler officially got his brand strategy title, because it's the moment the drift really accelerated. Marcus called a staff meeting to announce it, framed as good news for everyone, fresh energy, a modern perspective, someone to handle the parts of the business he and I had never particularly enjoyed. I remember sitting in that meeting, watching my line cooks' faces, all of them people who had worked 80-hour weeks beside me for years, doing the math silently the way I was doing it. None of us had ever been offered a title that didn't correspond to actual, demonstrated expertise. Tyler had been given his after 4 months of vague involvement. I said nothing that day. I told myself it wasn't worth the conflict over a title. I understand now that titles are rarely just titles. Priya and I had lunch together every few months during those years, ostensibly about the restaurant's finances, though we both understood it had become something closer to a check-in. She never once pushed me to tell Marcus about the transfer, respecting my mother's wishes as much as I did, but she'd occasionally ask, gently, whether I still felt it was the right call to stay quiet. "I trust you to know when the moment is right," she told me once, "but I want you to know the paperwork isn't going anywhere, and neither is the truth in it. It'll still be just as true whenever you decide to use it." The stock transfer paperwork itself sat in a folder in Priya's office and a duplicate copy in my own fireproof lockbox at home, untouched for years except for the tax filings Priya handled quietly every spring, always addressed to me directly, always something I filed away without ever mentioning at the restaurant. I remember, once, Dante asking why I didn't just keep a copy somewhere more accessible, in case I ever needed it quickly, and I told him honestly that some part of me didn't want it to be accessible, that keeping it slightly out of easy reach felt like a way of honoring my mother's actual wish, which was never really about the paperwork existing, but about it staying quiet until quiet no longer served anyone. Tyler's role kept expanding in the meantime, a director of brand strategy title by his second year, credit for marketing campaigns that were, in practice, largely built by a social media contractor Marcus paid separately, a corner office that had once been my mother's, repainted and refurnished within months of her death in a way that still, for years later, makes something in my chest go tight every time I walk past it. The 15th anniversary gala had been planned for almost a year, a genuine celebration, investors and longtime regulars and the local food press all invited, a chance to mark a decade and a half of a restaurant that had, against real odds, survived its founder's death and kept its reputation intact. I was proud of that anniversary. I want you to know I walked into that night proud, not bracing for a fight. I had absolutely no intention of the notebook in my pocket becoming anything other than what it always was, a habit, a comfort, a way of keeping my mother close while I worked. A few weeks before the gala, Marcus asked me to stay late after service to talk. He seemed nervous in a way I hadn't seen from him in years, choosing his words carefully as we sat at the same corner table where my mother used to watch the dinner rush. "I want to make an announcement at the anniversary gala," he said. "About Tyler stepping into an official operating role. Co-owner, on paper, effective that night. I wanted you to hear it from me first, not find out from a press release." I remember sitting very still, feeling something complicated move through me that wasn't quite anger yet, More like the specific vertigo of watching someone describe a house you're already living in as though they're the one who gets to decide whether you're allowed to stay. Marcus, I said carefully, you understand that any change to the ownership or operating structure requires sign-off from both stakeholders. That's standard for any restructuring like that. He waved a hand, not unkindly, the gesture of a man who'd stopped thinking of me as a stakeholder in anything but the kitchen a long time ago. It's mostly a formality, a title change for investor relations. Nothing that affects you day to day. You'll still run the kitchen exactly the way you always have. I didn't argue with him that night. I want to be honest about why. Some part of me still hoped, foolishly maybe, that he'd think better of it on his own, that some memory of my mother would surface and stop him before it became a public announcement in front of 40 investors. I went home that night and sat for a long time at my own kitchen table with my mother's notebook open in front of me, not reading it exactly, just holding my hand flat against a page of her handwriting the way I sometimes do when I need to think clearly about something. Dante found me there, well past midnight, and asked what was wrong before I'd said a word. 15 years of marriage teaches you to read a person's shoulders from across a room. I told him everything, the transfer, the 4 years of silence, Marcus's announcement, and he listened the whole way through without once interrupting, which is a skill I have always loved him for. When I finished, he asked me only one question: do you actually want to keep it quiet, or are you keeping it quiet because that's what you've always done? I didn't have an answer for him that night. I think, looking back, some part of me already did. I called Priya the next morning anyway, just to let her know there might be a situation at the gala where I'd need to reference the ownership structure directly, and asked her, almost as an afterthought, whether she'd be reachable by phone that evening if I needed her. I'll have my phone in my hand all night, she told me. I've been waiting 4 years for you to need me to say this part out loud, Joe. Whenever you're ready. I spent the days leading up to the gala doing exactly what I always did before a big service, building prep lists, tasting sauces, walking the dining room floor plan in my head until I could see it with my eyes closed. If I'm honest, some part of me used the work as a way of not thinking too hard about what might happen at the podium. Cooking has always been the place I go when I don't want to sit directly with a feeling. It's easier to perfect a beurre blanc than to sit with the specific ache of being erased from your own mother's legacy by two people who never once had to build anything themselves. 2 nights before the gala, I found myself standing in the walk-in cooler alone, doing inventory I didn't really need to do, and I let myself cry for the first time in months, not dramatically, just a quiet, private few minutes among the produce crates, the kind of crying you do specifically because nobody can see you do it. I thought about my mother telling me, years earlier, that I didn't need her name over the door to know what I was doing in that kitchen. I wondered, standing there, whether I'd let myself forget that on purpose, because it was easier than testing whether it was still true. Dante had never met my mother. We married 2 years after she died, but he'd heard enough about her from me, and from Marcus in the early years of our relationship, that he sometimes joked he felt like he knew her secondhand. He'd read parts of the notebook, carefully, the way you handle something you understand matters more than its physical weight suggests, and he'd once told me that reading her handwriting felt like meeting the person who taught me how to be exacting about the things that mattered. I've never forgotten that observation, mostly because it was exactly right. The morning of the gala, my husband Dante asked me, over coffee, whether I was going to be all right standing in a kitchen all night cooking for an event where Marcus might say something that hurt. I told him the truth, which was that I genuinely hoped it wouldn't come to that some part of me still believed Marcus would find a gentler way to say what he wanted to say, a way that didn't erase 4 years of me quietly holding up half of everything we'd built together since my mother died. I was wrong about that. But I want you to understand, walking into that kitchen that afternoon, apron on, notebook in my pocket the way it always was, I believed completely that the night would end with nothing more dramatic than good reviews and a full house. I remember tying my apron in the walk-in mirror by the office, checking my whites for stains one last time, entirely unaware that I was about to spend the evening as something other than just the chef. The gala was in full swing by 8, the dining room reconfigured with high-top tables and a small podium near the bar, string lights threaded through the exposed beams my mother had insisted on keeping when they renovated the space 15 years ago. I'd come out of the kitchen briefly, still in my whites, to check on a few tables of regulars, when Marcus tapped a fork against his glass and asked for everyone's attention. He thanked the investors for coming, thanked the staff in a general, sweeping way that didn't single anyone out, and then put a hand on Tyler's shoulder and smiled the warm, practiced smile he used for donors and press. "I want to make an announcement tonight," he said. "As many of you know, Callaway's has always been a family business, and tonight I'm proud to say that family is stepping fully into its future. Effective immediately, Tyler will be joining as co-owner and chief operating officer." He paused for the applause, which came, warm and generous, from a room that had no reason to know any better. Tyler represents the future of this family. The real family running this place going forward. I felt the room's attention slide past me the way it always had at moments like this, not unkindly, just completely, the specific loneliness of being professionally essential and personally invisible in the same breath. I thought about my mother's handwriting in my pocket. I thought about the particular way she used to say, watching me work a station as a teenager, "You don't have to raise your voice to be right. You just have to be sure." I set down the tray of amuse-bouches I'd been carrying out to a nearby table, handed it off to a passing server, and walked the 30 feet toward the podium, my chef's whites still faintly dusted with flour, entirely aware of how strange it must have looked, the chef walking calmly toward her own stepfather mid-announcement. I didn't hurry. There didn't seem to be any reason to. "Marcus," I said, and I was surprised by how level my own voice came out, carrying easily in a room that had gone quiet the way rooms do when something unplanned starts happening in real time. "Before this goes any further, I need to say something, because I don't think what you just announced is actually possible under the restaurant's current ownership structure." He turned toward me, still smiling, the smile of a man who assumed whatever I was about to say was a small, easily managed correction. "Joe, sweetheart, this really doesn't need to involve the kitchen staff. It's a business matter." "It is a business matter," I agreed. "Which is exactly why it needs my sign-off. Any change to executive operating roles requires approval from both stakeholders holding equity in the company. That's not a policy. It's in the operating agreement Priya drew up when the restaurant was founded." Marcus's smile faltered, just slightly, the first genuine crack in it all night. "Joe, I'm the majority owner of this restaurant." You're not the majority owner," I said quietly. "You're a 50% owner. You have been for 4 years. The room had gone very still, the particular stillness of 40 people realizing, all at once, that they were watching something they hadn't been invited to watch. Deborah's hand found Marcus's arm. Tyler's easy, practiced confidence flickered for the first time all evening. "That's not," Marcus started, and I watched the same arithmetic cross his face that I imagine crosses everyone's face in this exact kind of moment, the numbers rearranging themselves faster than the person wants them to. Renata's shares came to me. That was always the plan. "Mom never told you that," I said, still gently, still without raising my voice. "You assumed it. There's a difference, and I think, if you're honest with yourself right now, you already know which one it was." Deborah stepped forward slightly, her composure fraying at the edges. "This is absurd. Joe, you're the chef here. Nobody's disputing that. But ownership is a completely different matter, and I think you're confusing your role in the kitchen with—" "I'm not confusing anything," I said, turning toward her, keeping my voice level. "I've had legal ownership of half this restaurant since I was 28 years old. I understand that's inconvenient information to receive in front of 40 investors. It wasn't my intention to deliver it this way. But Marcus made an announcement tonight that isn't legally his to make alone, and I wasn't going to let that stand uncorrected. Mom's shares came to me," I said. 3 months before she died. Fully documented, fully legal, filed with the state the same week it happened. I've been a 50% owner of this restaurant since I was 28 years old, Marcus. I just never needed anyone to know that until right now." I took out my phone, already dialing, and set it on the podium beside him, on speaker. Priya picked up on the first ring, the way she'd promised she would. "Priya," I said, Can you confirm the current ownership structure of Callaway's for everyone here? 50% Marcus Reyes, 50% Josephine Callaway, Priya said, her voice clear and unhurried over the small phone speaker, carrying easily across a silent room. Transferred from Renata Callaway's estate via a stock transfer agreement, effective 4 years ago this March. Any operating restructuring requires both owners' signatures. I have the paperwork in front of me if anyone needs to see it. Marcus didn't say anything for a long moment. I watched him look at Tyler, then at Deborah, then, finally, at me, really at me, in a way I don't think he had in years. Someone near the bar cleared their throat, a nervous, uncertain sound, and I watched a few of the investors exchange glances, recalculating in real time exactly whose word they should be trusting about the restaurant's future they'd been invited to help fund. One of them, a woman I recognized from a regional restaurant group, stepped forward slightly. I think we'd all appreciate some clarity here before anyone signs anything tonight, she said, not unkindly, but firmly, and I watched Marcus absorb the reality that this was no longer a private family matter, if it had ever really been one. The paperwork is real, I said, to the room now, not just to Marcus. I'm not disputing anything my stepfather has built here. I've worked in this kitchen for 14 years, 6 of them as executive chef. I'm simply telling you the ownership structure as it actually exists, because an announcement was just made about it that isn't accurate, and I think everyone in this room deserves the accurate version before any investment decisions get made tonight. Priya's voice came through the phone speaker again, steady. I'm happy to provide documentation to any of tonight's investors directly, if that would be useful. I've handled Callaway's books for 13 years. This isn't a new or contested arrangement, it's simply one that hasn't been publicly disclosed until now. Marcus set his own glass down on the podium, slowly, the gesture of a man buying himself a few seconds to think. When he finally spoke again, his voice had lost the polished, celebratory register entirely. I think, he said, to the room, we should table the operating announcement for tonight. I clearly need to have a conversation with my daughter that I should have had 4 years ago. He didn't correct himself on the word daughter. I noticed. I don't think he did either, not right away. What happened after that wasn't loud at all, and I need you to stay with me for it, because the version of Marcus that showed up in the next 5 minutes wasn't the confident man who'd just stood at that podium, it was someone much quieter, and much more honest, than any of us had seen from him in a very long time. Marcus asked the room, quietly, for a few minutes, and the crowd, sensing correctly that something private had just become briefly public, gave a space with the particular tact of people who understand they've witnessed something they weren't meant to. The investors drifted toward the bar. The regular guests found their tables again. Deborah stood very still beside Marcus, her hand no longer on his arm. I remember looking, briefly, toward the kitchen doors, where 2 of my line cooks stood watching, wide-eyed, clearly having abandoned their stations for a minute to see what was happening. One of them, Marisol, who'd worked beside me for 4 years, gave me the smallest, steadiest nod, the kind of nod that says, without words, that someone has been rooting for you longer than you realized. I nodded back, and went back to the conversation in front of me, though that small exchange stayed with me for days afterward. I didn't know, Marcus said finally, to me, his voice rougher than I'd heard it in years. About the transfer. I want you to know that's true, I'm not pretending shock I don't feel. Renata never told me. She asked me not to tell you either, I said. She wanted you to treat me well because I was her daughter who'd earned her place in that kitchen. Not because a piece of paper said you had to. He was quiet for a long moment, and I watched something genuinely difficult cross his face, not anger, which might have been easier for both of us, but something closer to grief arriving 4 years late. I think I let myself believe, after she died, that keeping this place running was the same thing as honoring her, he said. And somewhere in there, I stopped actually looking at who was doing the honoring. I gave Tyler a title because it was easier than sitting with how much I still needed her here, and you were already here, every single night, and I mistook that for something that didn't need protecting because it wasn't going anywhere. I didn't rush to tell him it was fine. I want to be honest about that, Because it matters, I said. Thank you for saying that, because it was true, and I let the rest of it sit there, unresolved, the way most real things actually do. Tyler found me near the kitchen doors a little while later, his practiced ease entirely gone, replaced by something more uncertain and, I think, more honest than anything I'd seen from him in 3 years. I don't actually know how to run a kitchen, he said, abruptly, like the sentence had been sitting in him for a while. I've known that the whole time. I took the title because my mom wanted me to have it, and because it was easier than admitting I didn't know what I wanted to do with my life at 30. I'm sorry. Genuinely. I should have said that a long time ago instead of standing next to your success and calling it mine. I told him that admitting it now was worth something, and that if he actually wanted a real role at Callaway's, the door to the kitchen was open, the same door it always had been, but that it would mean starting exactly where I had, at the bottom, at 17, rolling gnocchi badly for a year before anyone let him do more. He laughed, a little, at that, and said he supposed he deserved a full year of bad gnocchi as penance. I told him it wasn't penance. It was just how you actually learn anything worth having. Deborah didn't find words as easily as her son had. She approached me carefully, days later, over coffee she'd asked to share, and admitted, haltingly, that she'd spent 2 years building a story in her head about what this family was supposed to look like, and that she'd never once actually asked me what it had looked like before she arrived. I don't know how to undo that, she said. I just wanted you to know I finally see it. I told her I appreciated her saying so, and I meant it, though I also told her, honestly, that seeing it now didn't erase 2 years of our restaurant said in a tone that had never once included me, and that I hoped whatever came next would actually be different, not just quieter. She nodded, and didn't argue, which I respected more than an immediate apology would have earned. Priya called me the week after the gala, mostly just to check in, and told me something I've thought about often since. Your mother asked me once, right before we signed the paperwork, whether I thought Marcus would ever really see you as an equal without it. I told her I didn't know. She said that was exactly why she was doing it, not because she was sure it would matter, but because she wanted the truth on paper regardless of whether anyone ever needed to read it. The investors, in the end, stayed. 2 of them found me in the kitchen afterward, genuinely impressed rather than spooked, telling me they respected how I'd handled a genuinely difficult moment without theatrics, and one of them, the woman from the regional restaurant group, said something I've held on to since: most people who actually own half of something don't need to raise their voice to prove it. That told me more about this restaurant's future than the toast did. Their investment closed within the month, this time with paperwork that reflected the ownership structure accurately from the start. I kept my 50%. That was never actually in question, it had been mine, legally and in every practical sense, for 4 years, and nothing that happened at that gala changed a single word of the paperwork, only what everyone in that room finally understood about it. But I did something my mother never explicitly told me to do, something I decided on my own, driving home that same night with the notebook back in my apron pocket where it belonged. I proposed a real operating structure to Marcus, transparent this time, with both our names on it properly, and an open invitation for Tyler to actually learn the business from the ground up if he wanted a genuine role in it rather than a borrowed title. Marcus and I sat down with Priya the following week to formalize it: clear operating roles, clear decision-making authority split according to what each of us actually did in the business, my name added visibly to everything it had quietly already been attached to for 4 years. It wasn't an easy conversation. Marcus asked, at one point, whether I'd ever forgive him for the years of assuming Tyler's role was uncomplicated, and I told him honestly that forgiveness wasn't really the right word for what I was working through. It was closer to recalibration, learning to trust that the version of him sitting across that table was the real one, rather than bracing for the version who'd stood at that podium. We put my name on the sign outside the following spring: Callaway's, EST by Renata Callaway and Marcus Reyes, chef owner Josephine Callaway, a small, specific correction that took 30 seconds to install and that I still find myself glancing at, most nights, on my way in for evening prep. Marcus suggested it himself, unprompted, which told me more about where he'd actually landed than any conversation could have. Marcus agreed to all of it within a week. Tyler started prep shifts the following month, badly, the way everyone starts badly, and I found myself, more than once, correcting his knife work with the same patient, exacting attention my mother once gave mine. I think about that gala often, and the thing I keep coming back to isn't the announcement, or the silence, or even Marcus's voice finally going quiet and honest in front of a room full of people who'd expected a celebration. It's the notebook. It's still in my apron pocket every single night, exactly where it's been for 6 years, her handwriting a little more faded each season, still legible enough to guide my hands through a Sunday gravy I could make with my eyes closed. Family, I've come to think, was never really the thing Marcus and I were arguing about that night. We were arguing about who gets to decide what a family's future looks like, and who simply has to stand in the kitchen, doing the actual work, while someone else describes that future out loud to a room of strangers. My mother never explained any of this to me directly. She just handed me a notebook, and 50% of everything she'd built, and trusted that the truth of it would hold even in the years before anyone else knew it existed. I think about her hands on that dough sometimes, more than 4 years later, and I think about the particular kind of patience it takes to teach someone gnocchi for a full year before they get it right, never once suggesting the failure meant anything about their future. That patience is the actual inheritance. The restaurant is just where I keep it. I still cook from that notebook every night. Tyler's gnocchi is getting better, slowly, the way mine did. Marcus comes into the kitchen sometimes now, just to watch, the way he used to watch my mother work before either of us understood exactly what we were both going to lose. Deborah came in for dinner last month, alone, on a Tuesday when the dining room was quiet, and asked to sit at the corner table by the kitchen pass, my mother's old table, the one where she used to watch the dinner rush with that expression I could never fully describe. Deborah didn't say much, just ate slowly and watched the kitchen work through its rhythm, and when she left, she stopped by the pass and said, simply, I understand now why she liked sitting here. I don't think we're close, not yet, maybe not ever in the way families in movies become close. But I think we're finally looking at the same restaurant, instead of 2 different ones layered on top of each other. If you've ever built something quietly, for years, while someone else got to stand at the podium and describe it as theirs, I'd love to hear about it. Tell me, in your own words, what your version of that notebook is, the small, ordinary thing that held the truth long before anyone else was ready to hear it. I read every single comment, and I promise you, you are not the only person who's ever had to say a number out loud to be believed. Thank you so much for staying with me through this one tonight. If it meant something to you, I'd be grateful if you'd subscribe for more, and I'll see you in the next story.